Good evening, friends. Tonight, we're slipping through the creaking doors of Victorian England into the hushed, candlelit world of the governess. Not quite a servant, not quite a lady, she was a ghost in starched petticoats, teaching Latin to children who barely noticed her, and navigating a life balanced on a razor's edge of propriety. These women were scholars, nurturers, and silent survivors of a society that demanded perfection but offered no mercy. And yet, there's one subject rarely whispered about, even in the most scandalous parlours. What happened when a governess fell in love, or worse, got pregnant? From clandestine affairs to desperate remedies and heart-wrenching choices made in the dead of night, their secrets were as heavy as the tomes they carried. So settle in, maybe light a candle for ambience, and let's step into their world together. Before we begin, if you enjoy these journeys into history's shadows, give this a like and subscribe, but only if you're truly captivated. Drop a comment to tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. It's always a thrill to know who's joining us across the globe. Now, dim the lights, let the young of the modern world fade, and picture this: a young woman, barely 20, standing in a grand house that's not her home. Her dress is plain, her hair pinned tightly, her hands clasped to hide their trembling. She's the governess, and her life is a performance where one wrong step could send her tumbling into ruin. In Victorian England, the governess was a paradox wrapped in muslin. She wasn't a scullery maid scrubbing pots, nor was she a lady sipping tea in a silk gown. She was educated, Latin, French, piano, poetry, but her knowledge was her cage. The Industrial Revolution had swelled the middle class, and families with new money wanted their children polished to aristocratic shine. Enter the governess, hired to teach etiquette, grammar, and just enough history to make young girls marriageable and young boys respectable. But respect, that was rarely hers. She ate alone, not with the family, not with the servants. Her room was a draughty attic, her salary a pittance, her status a tightrope. Society saw her as a necessity, like a good rug, useful but not admired. To the children she was a taskmaster, to the parents a convenience. To the men of the house, sometimes a temptation, sometimes a threat. But beneath her composed exterior, those tightly laced corsets and faultless curtsies, was a woman carrying dreams she could never voice. Love, freedom, a family of her own, those were luxuries for others. Her role was to mould young minds, not to feel, not to want, and certainly not to falter. Yet falter they did, because governesses were human, and humans have hearts that beat despite the rules. And when those hearts led to forbidden love, or, God forbid, a pregnancy, the consequences were as brutal as they were silent. Let's set the scene. A grand house in Yorkshire, 1850. Gas lamps flicker, casting shadows on mahogany panels. The children are asleep, their primers stacked neatly on the nursery table. Downstairs, the family laughs over sherry, their voices muffled by thick walls. Upstairs, the governess sits by a single candle, mending a hem or reading a forbidden novel she's hidden under her pillow. She's young, perhaps the daughter of a bankrupt clergyman. Educated but penniless, her only path this strange, lonely profession. Her life is governed by rules. Be invisible, be impeccable, be indispensable, but never noticed, and above all, be chaste. Because if there's one thing Victorian society couldn't tolerate, it was a governess who dared to love. Love was dangerous, but pregnancy? That was catastrophic. It wasn't just a scandal, it was a betrayal of the entire social order. A governess was supposed to be a moral beacon, a living lesson in virtue for the children she taught. If she was found to be with child, especially out of wedlock, she wasn't just dismissed, she was erased. Her reputation, her livelihood, her very identity would dissolve like sugar in tea. And so, governesses, who found themselves in this unthinkable situation, turned to desperate measures, secret liaisons, herbal concoctions, and choices so heart-wrenching they were never spoken aloud. This is their story, one of silk gloves and iron realities, of women who taught grace but lived in fear. Imagine signing a contract that owns your every breath. That was the governess's reality. She didn't choose this life, it chose her. Most governesses were women of gentle birth, fallen on hard times, daughters of failed merchants, widowed clergymen, or families bankrupted by bad investments. They had education but no dowry, brains but no prospects. Marriage was the golden ticket for most women, but for those without fortune, the governess trade was often the only respectable path. Respectable, but barely. It was a job that demanded everything and gave little in return. Her contract wasn't just a job description, it was a leash. She was to teach the children reading, writing, arithmetic, French, music, needlework. She was to correct their manners, curb their tantrums, and shape them into society's ideal. But she was also to be a shadow. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't sit in the drawing room unless invited. Don't expect kindness, only courtesy. Her wages, perhaps £20 sterling, 0 pence a year, enough for a few dresses and the occasional letter home, but never enough to save, to escape. Every expense, her ink, her candles, her very breath, came with a debt to the family she served. And then there was the unspoken clause, remain pure. Victorian society obsessed over female virtue, and the governess, living in someone else's home, was under constant scrutiny. A flirtatious glance, a lingering conversation with a male guest, could spark whispers. An affair? Unthinkable. A pregnancy? It was social suicide, a one-way ticket to the workhouse, or worse. The governess was expected to be a nun in all but name, her heart locked away as tightly as her corset. But hearts don't always obey, and in the quiet of those grand houses, temptation was never far away. The men of the household, fathers, brothers, visiting cousins, were the greatest danger. They saw the governess daily, her quiet intelligence, her gentle voice, her isolation. To some she was a puzzle, a challenge, to others a conquest. She wasn't a servant they could openly proposition, but she wasn't a lady they had to court. She was in limbo, and that made her vulnerable. A kind word from the master of the house could feel like a lifeline to a lonely governess. A stolen kiss could feel like love. But love was a trap, and pregnancy was its deadliest snare. Let's talk about love, or what passed for it in the governess's world. It wasn't the stuff of poetry, not at first. It was a glance across the dining room, a brush of fingers when passing a book, a conversation about Shelley that lasted just a moment too long. The governess lived in a house full of people, but was achingly alone. Her only companions were children who saw her as a task, servants who resented her airs, and a mistress who treated her like furniture. So when a man paid her attention, it was like sunlight after years of rain. The master of the house was often the culprit. He was older, perhaps bored with his wife's endless social climbing, charmed by the governess's quiet wit, or it was the eldest son, home from Oxford, restless and reckless, seeing in her a forbidden thrill. Sometimes it was a guest, a dashing captain or a brooding poet, who found her more interesting than the giggling debutantes. These men weren't offering marriage. Governesses were rarely marriageable in their eye. They offered flattery, secrecy, a taste of something alive in a life that felt half dead. But love or lust came with a price. The governess knew the rules. A single misstep could cost her everything, yet some risked it, because in those stolen moments, behind the library shelves, in the garden after dusk, they felt human. They felt seen. A governess might meet her lover in the conservatory, their whispers drowned by the patter of rain on glass. She might slip a note into his hand, her heart pounding as she prayed no one saw, and if that love led to intimacy, to a night in a guest room or a hurried embrace in the attic, the consequences were immediate and terrifying. Pregnancy wasn't just a personal crisis, it was a public one. The governess's body was no longer her own. It belonged to the family, to the house, to the ideal of virtue she was paid to uphold. A swelling belly was proof of sin, a stain on the household's honour. The mistress would be furious, not at her husband, oh no, but at the governess who dared to disrupt the facade. The children would be sent away, the servants would gossip, and the governess would be cast out, her name blackened, her future gone. So when the first signs appeared, missed cycles, nausea, a tightening waist, she didn't rejoice. She panicked. The moment a governess suspected she was pregnant, her world became a stage, and she was the actress playing for her life. Morning sickness? Blame it on a bad egg at breakfast. Fatigue? Just a touch of nerves from teaching unruly children. A missed cycle? Never mention it, not even to the laundry maid who might notice. Everything was a performance. She tightened her corset until she could barely breathe, risking her health to hide the slightest curve. She walked with deliberate grace, avoiding any movement that might betray her secret. Behind closed doors, she was a strategist. Governesses shared whispered remedies, passed down like forbidden scriptures. A tea of pennyroyal, steeped strong, might bring on the courses. Tanzio rue, crushed and swallowed with a prayer, promised similar results. These weren't gentle herbs, they were poisons, and the line between cure and catastrophe was thin. She'd drink the bitter brew in her attic room, wincing at the cramps, praying it worked, praying she survived, and all the while she had to teach conjugation, correct posture, smile at the mistress, and ignore the man who'd caused this, now avoiding her gaze. The governess became a master of deception. She'd alter her dresses, letting out seams under the guise of mending. She'd stand at angles in the schoolroom, hiding her profile. She'd feign headaches to avoid dinners, where prying eyes might notice her pallor. Some even padded their skirts to mimic a fuller figure, hoping to delay suspicion. It was exhausting, a daily battle against her own body, against biology itself, and the stakes were sky high. If the household discovered her condition, there'd be no forgiveness, only judgment. The irony was cruel. The governess tasked with teaching morality, was condemned for her humanity. Society preached virtue, but turned a blind eye to the men who preyed on her vulnerability. The master might escape with a tisk and a smirk. The governess would lose everything. So she hid, she lied, she drank the teas, and she prayed. Because in the Victorian world, a pregnant governess wasn't a woman, she was a problem, and problems were solved in silence. Let's talk about the governess's secret weapon, the herbal remedy. Not the chamomile for a restless night, but the kind that promised to fix what society deemed unforgivable. Pennyroyal, tansy, serene. These were the names whispered in attic rooms, scribbled on scraps of paper passed between women who understood. These herbs weren't sold in apothecaries with cheerful labels. They were gathered from hedgerows, bought from shady herbalists, or smuggled by sympathetic maids. And they weren't sipped for pleasure, they were gulped in desperation. Pennyroyal tea, brewed strong, was the most common. It tasted like mint laced with regret and could induce bleeding, if you were lucky. Too little and it did nothing. Too much and it could kill, leaving you sweating, convulsing, or worse. Tansy was another favourite, its yellow flowers hiding a bitter power. Mixed with gin, it was said to work faster, though the cramps felt like a knife. Savin from the juniper bush was the nuclear option, reserved for the truly desperate. It promised results, but often delivered hemorrhage or death. These remedies were part folklore, part science, all risk. Governesses learned them from each other, from old servants, from women who'd survived the same crisis. Steep it for an hour, one might whisper. Add honey to mask the taste, another would advise. They drank alone, in the dark, listening to the house creak, hoping the pain meant it was working. And they kept working, teaching sums, playing piano, smiling through the nausea, because stopping meant suspicion. The governess's life was a masquerade, and the herbal tea was her backstage prop. If the teas failed, the options grew darker. Some turned to physical methods, binding their abdomens so tightly they could barely breathe, hoping to force the body to reject the pregnancy. Others sought out backstreet midwives, not the kind who delivered babies, but the kind who ended them. These women operated in shadows, their tools crude, their methods brutal. A governess might knock on a door in a slum, coins clutched in her hand, praying for discretion. The risk was enormous: infection, infertility, death. But so was the alternative. When herbs weren't enough, the governess turned to the midwives of the underworld. They weren't called midwives, not officially. They were wise women, aunts, or simply her. No shingle hung above their doors, no record marked their trade. They were ghosts, like the governesses themselves, known only by reputation. A name whispered by a maid, a note slipped under a door. You found them in the slums of London or the back alleys of Manchester, where gaslights didn't reach. These women were often former governesses or servants, aged out of their roles, surviving by fixing society's unspoken problems. Their tools were makeshift: knitting needles, boiled rags, a bottle of gin for courage. The procedure was quick, painful, and perilous. No anesthesia, no sanitation, just a prayer and a clenched fist. The governess would lie on a table or a straw mattress, biting a cloth to stifle her cry. If she was lucky, she'd walk away, bleeding but alive. If not, she'd be another statistic, a fever victim in the parish records. Payment was whatever she could spare. A hairpin, a ribbon, a few shillings saved from her wages. Silence was part of the deal. These midwives didn't ask questions, didn't judge, they understood, because many had been there themselves. One story tells of a midwife who kept a locket from a governess, a tiny portrait inside, as payment for her silence. She wore it like a badge, a reminder of the lives she'd touched and saved. But the risks were real. A botched procedure could mean death or lifelong damage, and if the authorities caught wind, there was no mercy. Abortion was illegal, a crime for both the woman and the midwife. Yet these women were lifelines. In a world that offered no safety net, they were the net, frayed and fragile, but there. They worked in candlelight, their hands steady despite the fear, their voices low with warnings don't tell a soul, and the governess, trembling, would nod, knowing this was her only chance to reclaim her life, or what was left of it. In the governess's arsenal of secrets, the boiling bath was a whispered myth, a last resort when teas and midwives failed. The idea was simple and horrific. Soak in water so hot it shocked the body into rejecting the pregnancy. Picture a tin tub in a cramped attic, filled with water heated to scalding. The governess would lower herself in, teeth gritted, skin burning, praying the pain meant progress. It was like a penance, a self-inflicted punishment for a sin society had already judged. Some added herbs, pennyroyal again, or mugwort, to the water, believing it amplified the effect. Others drank gin first, dulling the pain, but not the fear. The instructions were grim. Stay until you faint. Fainting meant it was working. Fainting also meant you might not wake up. Burns, shock, heart failure. The risks were as real as the desperation. Accounts exist of governesses found unconscious, dragged from tubs by panicked maids, only to die quietly in their rooms, the household none the wiser. A governess's death was inconvenient, not tragic. The boiling bath persisted because it was discreet. No midwife, no tools, just water and willpower. The governess could do it alone, locking her door, muffling her gasps. She'd emerge, if she emerged, pale and shaking, and return to her duties as if nothing had happened, because in the Victorian world, nothing was allowed to have happened. A governess didn't just hide her pregnancy, she hid her pain, her fear, her very self, and the bath, scolding and silent, was her accomplice. When all else failed, the governess turned to binding, not just the corset she wore daily, but a tighter, crueler version, designed to conceal or destroy. Long strips of linen or muslin were wrapped around her abdomen, pulled so tight her ribs ached and her breath came in gasps. It was called stomach binding, a polite term for a desperate act. The goal? Hide the pregnancy, or in some cases, force the body to reject it. It was a corset of shame, a physical denial of biology. The governess became a sculptor of her own body, moulding it to fit society's demands. She'd bind herself before dawn, wincing as she pulled the cloth taut, then dress over it, her silhouette unchanged. She'd teach, walk, play the piano, all while fighting dizziness and pain. Some bound so tightly they couldn't eat, couldn't sit, could barely speak. But they did it, because a visible pregnancy was a death sentence, socially, professionally, sometimes literally. Binding didn't stop the pregnancy. Not really. It delayed discovery, buying time to find another solution. But it came at a cost. Fainting was common, as was internal damage, ruptured tissues, compressed organs, lifelong pain. Some governesses slept with the binding on, as if constant pressure could erase the life inside them. It couldn't, of course, but the act was a ritual of control in a life with none. The governess bound her body, her heart, her future, all to preserve the illusion that she was still the perfect, virtuous shadow. In the governess's world, desperation bred creativity. When herbs, baths, and bindings failed, some turned to folklore, to remedies that felt like prayers. One was the rice ritual, a bizarre blend of superstition and hope. Rice, soaked in vinegar or gin, was moulded into balls and eaten in secret, believed to weaken the womb. The logic was shaky, the desperation palpable. Governesses heard these tales from maids, from old aunts, from the whispers of women who'd survived. The recipe varied. Some added garlic or ginger, others a pinch of salt for purity. The governess would eat the rice alone, often chanting a quiet verse, "Leave me, little one, for this is not your time." It was part ritual, part placebo, a way to feel in control when control was a myth. Did it work? Rarely, unless you count nausea as success. But it offered comfort, a moment of agency in a life dictated by others. The governess, swallowing her sour rice, was praying not just for her body, but for her soul. These rituals were heartbreakingly human. They weren't about science, they were about hope, however fragile. The governess, trained to teach logic, clung to these scraps of magic because they were all she had. She ate her rice, whispered her prayers, and returned to the schoolroom, her smile as practiced as her penmanship, because in her world, survival meant pretending, even to herself, that everything was fine. And what of the man? The master, the son, the guest who'd whispered promises in the dark? He was gone as surely as the governess's peace. Victorian men didn't take responsibility for such scandals. They were married, or soon to be, their reputations shielded by wealth and gender. A governess might hope for help, a few coins, a kind word, but hope was a fool's game. The man who'd kissed her in the library now avoided her in the hall, his eyes cold, his memory conveniently blank. Some men left money, slipped to a servant with instructions to handle it. Others denied everything, claiming they'd never met her, never touched her. The governess was a fantasy after all, a teacher, a muse, not a woman with a future. When that fantasy broke, when her body betrayed the affair, he vanished. Society didn't blame him, it blamed her. She was the temptress, the fallen woman. Never mind that she had no power, no choice. The father's silence was deafening. And the governess learned quickly that love was a luxury she couldn't afford. If the governess's secret was discovered, the house turned against her. The mistress, humiliated by the stain on her home, would lead the charge. Servants, once allies, became spies, reporting her every move. The children, sensing tension, grew cruel or distant. The master, if he was the culprit, might feign shock, his betrayal hidden behind a mask of outrage. The governess was no longer a person. She was a crisis, a threat to the family's good name. Punishment was swift. Some governesses were locked in their rooms, interrogated, shamed. Others were dismissed without reference, their bags packed by dawn. The lucky ones were sent away quietly, perhaps to a distant relative. The unlucky were cast out, penniless, their names whispered in parlours as a cautionary tale. In extreme cases, the household might force her to resolve the pregnancy, arranging a visit to a backstreet midwife or worse, the governess's body. Her choices, her very life, belonged to the house. Until it didn't. The silence was the worst part. No one spoke of her after she left. The children were told she'd gone to care for a sick aunt. The servants were warned not to gossip. The family resumed their lives, their honour intact, while the governess became a ghost, her story buried in the attic with her old primers. But she wasn't forgotten, not by the other governesses, who whispered her name as a warning. Be careful, or you'll end up like her. Some governesses didn't wait for judgment. They ran. In Victorian England, a runaway governess was a scandal in itself, a breach of contract, a betrayal of duty. But for those facing pregnancy, running was survival. They fled under cover of night, trading their starched dresses for plain cloaks, their pinned hair for a loose braid. They slipped through servants' entrances, hid in hay carts, or walked miles to a train station, their savings sewn into their hems. Where did they go? Anywhere but there. A sister's cottage in the country, a charity home in London, a convent that asked no questions. Some sought work as seamstresses or maids, hiding their education to avoid suspicion. Others vanished entirely, their fates unknown. Running wasn't freedom, it was a gamble. A governess caught could be dragged back, shamed publicly, or worse. But for many, the open road was better than the closed door of a household that had already judged them. The stories of runaways became legends. One governess, it was said, fled to a fishing village, raising her child as a widow. Another joined a travelling troupe, her accent and manners hidden behind stage paint. These tales, half true, gave hope to others, a reminder that escape was possible, however perilous. Because in a world that bound you with rules and corsets, running was the ultimate act of defiance. And if a governess couldn't run, couldn't end the pregnancy, couldn't hide forever, she gave birth in secret, an act as daring as it was dangerous. These were silent deliveries, performed in attics or cellars, with no midwife, no fanfare, only pain and fear. She'd stuff a rag in her mouth to muffle her cries, praying the household slept. A loyal maid might help, bringing towels or boiling water, but most governesses faced it alone, their only companion the flickering candle. The birth was quick, not out of ease, but necessity. The baby, tiny and fragile, was wrapped in a shawl, hidden in a drawer or under a floorboard. The governess would clean herself, bind her bleeding body, and return to her duties, her face a mask of calm. The child couldn't stay. The house had no room for innocence, no tolerance for truth. Some babies were kept for days, fed in secret, loved in whispers, but it was temporary. The governess knew the child's fate was out of her hands. The final act was the hardest. The governess would take her child, often at night, to a place of last resort, a church doorstep, a foundling hospital, a quiet corner of a cemetery. These were the shrines of sorrow, where society's unwanted were left to chance. She'd swaddle the baby tightly, perhaps tucking a note with a name or a prayer. Then she'd walk away, her heart breaking with every step. No goodbye, no tears, just the sound of her own breath. in the cold air. If she was lucky, a nun or a stranger might find the child, raising it in an orphanage or a workhouse. If not, the baby joined the countless others lost to the night. The governess didn't abandon her child because she didn't love it. She did it because love was all she had, and it wasn't enough. The household, the law, the world offered no protection. She gave her child the only gift she could, a chance, however slim, at life. These places were haunted, not by ghosts, but by grief. Locals spoke of cries in the night, of shadows lingering near church gates. The governess, if she survived, carried the weight forever. Some returned to leave flowers or pray, a silent apology to a child they'd never know. Others never looked back, too broken to bear it. But all of them remembered, because some losses are too deep to forget. In Victorian England, an unborn or abandoned child wasn't just a tragedy, it was a spirit. They were called little ghosts, souls caught between worlds, neither fully here nor gone. The governess, already a ghost in her own life, felt a kinship with these spirits. They haunted her dreams, her prayers, her quiet moments. Some believed they brought bad luck, illness, misfortune, a chill that lingered. To appease them, governesses turned to secret rituals, small acts of atonement in a world that offered none. The ritual was simple but heavy. She'd light a candle in her room, whisper a prayer, leave an offering, a ribbon, a coin, a tiny doll sewn from scraps. Some visited churches, slipping into pews to pray for the child they'd lost. Others left tokens at crossroads, places said to bridge the living and the dead. It was the only motherhood they were allowed, a fleeting connection to a life they couldn't claim. The governess, trained to teach order, found solace in these acts of chaos, these quiet rebellions against a world that silenced her. The little ghosts were more than spirits. They were reminders. They spoke of love, however brief, in a life of restraint. They spoke of resilience, of women who carried unbearable pain and still stood, still taught, still smiled. The governess's strength wasn't in her lessons or her manners. It was in her silence, her endurance, her ability to keep going when everything inside her screamed to stop. The Victorian governess was a warrior, though no one wrote ballads about her. She fought not with swords but with silence, not with banners but with books. She carried her pain like a second skin, hidden beneath her starched collar. She taught grammar while her heart broke, corrected posture while her body bled, smiled at the mistress while her future crumbled. Her strength was in her endurance, her ability to perform when the world demanded perfection and offered only judgment. Governesses protected each other in small, defiant ways. A shared glance, a smuggled herb, a warning whispered in the hall. They taught the younger ones the codes, how to hide, how to lie, how to survive. They weren't fragile, though society wanted them to be. They were steel, forged in the fire of expectation and tempered by loss. No one celebrated their victories. There were no medals for teaching through tears, no honors for surviving scandal, but they endured, and that was enough. They were artists of survival, painting their pain with poise. They were scholars of silence, writing their stories in the margins of primers. They were mothers, if only for a moment, to children they'd never hold. And they were women, human and flawed, in a world that punished them for both, Their strength wasn't loud, but it was deep, a quiet rebellion against a system that tried to erase them. The governess was never meant to be remembered. She was a tool, a shadow, a means to an end. When she left dismissed, disgraced, or simply done, her name faded like ink on cheap paper. No portraits hung in the grand houses, no diaries were published, no statues marked her place. The pregnant governess was the least remembered of all, her story too shameful, too inconvenient for history's pages. But she existed. Behind every lesson, every curtsy, was a woman fighting to be seen. She carried knowledge like a shield, love like a wound, shame like a shadow. She was punished for wanting, exiled for feeling, buried in history's footnotes like a mistake. Yet she fought, not with fists but with fortitude, not with cries but with quiet. She protected her sisters, her secrets, her small acts of defiance, a shared remedy, a hidden birth, a prayer at a crossroads. These were her. Remembering her isn't just about justice, it's about truth. It's about lifting the veil of Victorian propriety and seeing the women beneath. They weren't weak, though society called them so. They weren't shameful, though the world branded them. They were trapped, and they survived. Some are honoured only by the flowers left at old church gates. Some live in the faded pages of forgotten novels. Most are unnamed, their stories lost to time. But tonight, we remember them. Not just the governesses they were forced to be, but the women they were, the mothers they might have been, the dreams they carried in silence. They lived in shadows, but they don't belong there. Their strength, their pain, their resilience deserve light. So let's hold that candle high for the governesses who taught, who loved, who lost, and who endured. Because in their silence they spoke volumes, and in their shadows they shone. So we've walked through the governess's world, her silent battles, her whispered remedies, her heartbreaks hidden behind starched collars. But what happened when the candle burned out? When the pregnancy was resolved, or the scandal broke, or the children grew too old for lessons? The governess didn't just vanish like a character in a novel, though society wished she would. Her story didn't end with dismissal or a secret birth. It continued, often in ways as complex and shadowed as her time in the grand house. Tonight, let's follow her out the servants' door, into the fog of Victorian England, where survival demanded new disguises and new dreams. Picture her now, no longer the governess, but a woman unmoored. Her contract is over. Maybe she was let go after a scandal. Maybe the children outgrew her. Maybe she fled in the night. Her trunk is packed with a few dresses, a worn Bible, and a bundle of letters she'll never send. She's 25, or 30, or older. Her youth spent teaching other people's children, while her own life waited in the wings. If she was lucky, she left with a reference, a scrap of paper that might open another door. If not, she's a ghost, her past a liability, her future a question mark. Where does she go? What does she become? And if she carried a child, born or lost, how does that weight shape her path? The Victorian world wasn't kind to women without anchors. A governess, once dismissed, couldn't simply waltz into another profession. Her education set her apart from maids or factory girls, but her status barred her from the drawing rooms of the elite. She was too refined for the workhouse, too poor for independence. And if her reputation was tarnished by pregnancy, rumour, or even a hint of impropriety, she was marked, her name a whisper in agency offices that placed governesses in homes. Yet these women didn't fade quietly. They adapted, they fought, they carved out lives in the margins of a society that preferred them invisible. Let's start with the governess who escaped scandal, who hid her pregnancy, or ended it, in secret. She might find another post, perhaps in a smaller house, far from the gossip of her last employer. She'd arrive with a new name, a fabricated story, her references forged by a sympathetic friend or a bribe to a clerk. The work was the same, conjugating verbs, correcting penmanship, smiling through the loneliness. But she was different now. Her eyes sharper, her heart guarded. She'd learned the cost of trust, the danger of a kind word from a gentleman. She taught with precision, but her laughter was rarer, her silences deeper. Some governesses, though, couldn't return to the schoolroom. A pregnancy, even if resolved, left traces. Physical weakness, emotional scars, or a reputation that followed like a shadow. These women turned to other trades, each a step down in society's eyes, but a step toward survival. Seamstressing was common, the governess's nimble fingers, stitching dresses she'd never wear. She might work in a shop, her accent and manners charming customers who'd never guessed her past, or she might become a companion, a paid friend to an elderly widow, her days filled with reading aloud and pouring tea, her nights haunted by what might have been. Others went further afield. The Industrial Revolution was churning, and cities like London and Manchester buzzed with opportunity and desperation. A governess might take a job in a factory, her education useless amid the clatter of looms. She'd trade her muslin for coarse cotton, her Latin for long hours at a machine. It was grueling, but it was anonymous, and anonymity was safety. Some found work as clerks or telegraph operators, new roles opening as technology reshaped the world. These jobs paid little, but they offered a sliver of independence, a chance to be something other than a shadow. And then there were the bold ones, the governesses who refused to fade. Some became writers, penning novels or articles under pseudonyms, their stories of love and loss veiled in fiction. Think of the Bronte sisters, themselves governesses, whose books, Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, gave voice to the passion and pain of women like them. Others turned to teaching in charity schools, shaping the minds of the poor rather than the privileged. It wasn't glamorous, but it was purposeful, a way to reclaim the knowledge that had once been their cage. But what of the governess who gave birth, the one who left her child at a church gate, or fled with it in her arms? Her path was the hardest, her choices the starkest. If she kept her child, she faced a world that branded her a fallen woman. Marriage was unlikely, few men would wed a governess with a bastard child, and fewer still would overlook her past. She might pass herself off as a widow, a common lie that softened society's judgment. With a cheap ring on her finger, she'd seek work as a seamstress or a lodging-house keeper, her child tucked away in cramped rooms, fed on scraps of her wages. Raising a child alone was a battle. Victorian England offered no safety net, no child care, no welfare, only charity that came with sermons and shame. The governess turned mother worked tirelessly, her hands raw from sewing or scrubbing, her nights spent soothing a hungry child. She tells stories to her son or daughter, tales of grand houses and Latin verbs, hoping they'd never know the truth of her fall. But the truth was there, in her tired eyes, in the way she flinched at a knock on the door, fearing the past had found her. Some couldn't keep their children. Poverty, illness, or the threat of discovery forced them to surrender. Foundling hospitals, like London's Coram Hospital, took in thousands of infants, their mothers weeping as they handed over their babies with a token, a button, a ribbon, to identify them if they ever returned. Most never did. The governess would walk away, her arms empty, her heart a wound that never healed. She'd return to work, perhaps as a governess again, teaching other people's children while her own grew up, a stranger, if they survived at all. Others sent their children to the countryside, to relatives or wet nurses, paying what little they could to keep them alive. These governesses lived in limbo, their wages split between survival and their child's care, their letters filled with lies to hide their shame. The child might grow up believing their mother was a distant aunt, their true story buried in a drawer with the governess's old primers. It was a sacrifice, but it was love, the kind that hurt more than it healed. Not every governess faded into obscurity. Some, scarred by their own struggles, became warriors in a different fight. The Victorian era was a time of reform. Women's rights, education, labour, and former governesses, with their intellect and resilience, were at the forefront. They saw the system that had trapped them and vowed to dismantle it, brick by brick. These women didn't just survive, they reshaped the world that had tried to break them. Consider the Governess's Benevolent Institution, founded in 1843. It was a lifeline for women like our governess, offering pensions, housing, and emergency funds for those cast out or too old to work. Former governesses ran it, their voices steady as they argued for better wages, better conditions, a future where women like them weren't discarded. They published pamphlets, held meetings, and lobbied for change, their stories fueling a quiet revolution. A pregnant governess, once a scandal, became a cause, a reason to fight for women's dignity. Some turned to education reform. They opened schools for girls, not just the daughters of the elite, but the poor, the orphaned, the forgotten. These schools taught more than needlework. They taught independence, the kind the governess had been denied. Women like Frances Buss, who started as a governess, built institutions like the North London Collegiate School, proving that education could be a woman's salvation, not her cage. They fought for teacher training, for certification, for a world where a governess wasn't a servant but a professional. Others joined the women's suffrage movement, their voices rising in halls where they'd once been silent. A governess who'd hidden her pregnancy or fled a scandal knew the cost of society's rules. She marched, she wrote, she spoke, demanding the vote, the right to own property, the chance to be more than a shadow. Her pain became her power, her silence, her manifesto. She wasn't just fighting for herself, but for the daughters she'd taught, the child she'd lost, the women who'd come after her. The governess's story didn't just live in attics or alleyways. It lived in ink. Victorian literature is filled with her shadow. Jane Eyre, The Turn of the Screw, Agnes Grey. These weren't just novels, they were confessions written by women who'd walked the governess's path or knew those who had. Charlotte Bronte, Anne Bronte, Elizabeth Gaskell. They gave the governess a voice, a face, a heart. Their heroines loved, suffered, and survived. Their stories a mirror to the real women who inspired them. Jane Eyre is the most famous, a governess who dares to love her employer, Mr. Rochester, and demands respect as his equal. Jane's strength, her refusal to be a mistress or a martyr, resonated with governesses who read her story in stolen moments. But Jane was lucky. She got a happy ending. Most governesses didn't. Their stories were messier, their loves less redemptive, their scandals less forgivable. Yet these novels kept their struggles alive, whispering to readers that the governess was more than a stereotype. She was a woman, and her pain was real. Some governesses wrote their own stories, often anonymously. In magazines like the English Woman's Review, they published essays about their lives, the loneliness, the exploitation, the impossible standards. They wrote of pregnancies hushed up, of dismissals without cause, of dreams crushed by corsets and contracts. These words were small rebellions, proof that the governess wasn't invisible, not entirely. Her pen was her sword, and she wielded it with precision, even if no one knew her name. For some governesses, England was too small, too suffocating. They looked beyond its shores, to the colonies, Australia, Canada, India, where the Victorian Empire stretched its arms. The 1850s and 1860s saw thousands of women, many former governesses, board ships for new lives. They were lured by promises of work, marriage, or simply a fresh start. The governess, who'd faced scandal, saw the colonies as a blank slate, a place where her past couldn't follow. In Australia, governesses were in demand, teaching the children of wealthy settlers. The work was familiar, but the world was different, harsher, wilder, less bound by etiquette. A governess might find herself in a remote homestead, her only companions the children and the wind. Some married farmers or merchants, their education a rare asset in a frontier society. Others opened schools, their classrooms filled with the children of convicts and pioneers. It wasn't easy, but it was a chance to be someone new, to leave the attic behind. In India, governesses served British families, teaching Mem Sahib's daughters to curtsy in the heat of Calcutta. The pay was better, but the isolation was worse, and the risk of scandal followed. A pregnancy here was just as damning, the gossip even fiercer among the tight-knit colonial elite. Yet some governesses thrived, their resilience honed by years of survival. They learned languages, adapted to new customs, and built lives far from the fog of England. The journey wasn't without cost. Ships were cramped, disease was rampant, and many never reached their destination. Those who did faced loneliness, prejudice, and the constant fear of failure. But for a governess who'd already lost everything, the colonies offered hope. A faint, flickering chance to rewrite her story. She packed her pain with her primers, her courage with her corset, and sailed into the unknown. The governess's story doesn't end with her departure, her reinvention, or her rebellion. It echoes in the world we live in the women who teach, who write, who fight for a voice. The Victorian governess was a pioneer, not of land or gold, but of survival. She navigated a world that demanded her silence and found ways to speak Through her work, her writing, her quiet acts of defiance, she was the mother who left her child at a church gate, the writer who penned a novel, the reformer who built a school. She was all of them and none of them, 1,000 stories woven into one. Her legacy is complicated. She helped shape the Victorian ideal, polish children, proper homes, but she also exposed its cracks. Her scandals, her pregnancies, her flights were proof that the system was flawed, that virtue couldn't be enforced with corsets and contracts. She forced society to look at its hypocrisy, even if it refused to change. The reforms she sparked, better wages, better education, women's rights, were her victory, won not with fanfare, but with persistence. Today, we see her in every teacher who fights for her students, every writer who tells an unpopular truth, every woman who refuses to be invisible. Her attic is gone, but her spirit lingers in the classrooms, the books, the quiet moments when a woman chooses herself over shame. She taught us that strength isn't always loud, that survival is its own kind of rebellion. Her name may be forgotten, but her story is in the margins, the shadows, the spaces where women have always fought to be seen. So, let's light another candle, not just for the governess, but for every woman who carried more than she was allowed, who loved more than she was permitted, who survived more than anyone knew. They were the ghosts of Victorian England, but they were also its heartbeat. And tonight we hear it still, steady and unbroken, in the silence they refused to accept. The governess's story doesn't end with her reinvention or her rebellion, nor with the ship that carried her to a new world. It stretches into the quiet years, the ones history rarely records, the twilight of a life spent balancing on society's edge. These were the years when the governess, no longer young, no longer bound by a contract, faced a new kind of invisibility. Her hands, once swift with chalk or needle, grew stiff. Her eyes, sharp from spotting a child's mistake, dimmed. Yet her spirit, forged in the crucible of survival, burned on. Tonight, let's follow her into those final chapters, where the governess became something more than a shadow, a memory, a myth, a quiet force that shaped the world in ways no one expected. Picture her now, in the 1870s, or 1880s, her hair streaked with grey, her dress still plain but patched with care. She's 40, or 50, or older, her youth a distant memory of attic rooms and whispered fears. If she was lucky, she's settled, perhaps in a modest cottage, perhaps in a city boarding house, her days filled with small routines, mending, reading, writing letters to a sister or a friend. If she wasn't, she's scraping by, her savings gone, her health fragile, her future a daily negotiation with fate. Whether she bore a child, fled a scandal, or simply aged out of her role, the governess's later years were a testament to her endurance. A life stitched together from fragments of courage. The Victorian world didn't make room for aging governesses. There were no pensions, no safety nets, only the grudging charity of institutions like the governess's benevolent institution, which offered a bed or a few shillings to the fortunate few. Society expected her to vanish quietly, her purpose spent, when the children she taught married or moved on. But governesses didn't vanish. They adapted, they connected, they built lives in the cracks of a system that tried to forget them, and in their twilight they became something unexpected. Keepers of secrets, weavers of stories, and quiet architects of change. The governess didn't face her later years alone, not always. In the shadows of Victorian cities, she found others like her, women who taught, loved, lost, and survived. They formed a silent sisterhood, a network of former governesses, companions, and teachers who understood the weight of a life lived on the margins. These women met in tea rooms, church basements, or cramped parlours. Their conversations a tapestry of shared pain and defiance. They weren't friends in the way society imagined, with calling cards and formal visits. They were comrades, bound by the battles they'd fought and the secrets they'd kept. This sisterhood was practical as much as emotional. A governess with a spare room might take in another, charging only what she could pay. One with connections might whisper of a job, typing, tutoring, or reading to the blind. They pooled resources, sharing coal in winter, mending each other's clothes, passing along books or newspapers too costly to buy. If one had faced pregnancy or scandal, the others didn't judge. They'd been there or close enough, and their silence was a gift. A cup of tea, a knowing nod, a warning about a shady employer. These were their currency, their way of saying, "You're not alone." Some of these networks grew formal, like the Women's Cooperative Guild or local branches of the governess's benevolent institution. Here, former governesses organized lectures, wrote petitions, or raised funds for the destitute among them. They advocated for better training, for schools that valued teachers over appearances, for a world where a woman's worth wasn't tied to her chastity or her youth. These gatherings weren't loud. No banners, no marches, but they were revolutionary. A governess who'd once hidden her pregnancy now spoke of wages. One who'd fled a grand house now demanded respect. Their voices, once silenced, grew stronger in numbers. The sisterhood also preserved stories. In quiet moments, over darned stockings or weak tea, they shared their pasts. Not just the scandals, but the triumphs. One might tell of a child she'd taught to love poetry, now a scholar at Oxford. Another might speak of a novel she'd published, its heroine a governess who dared to dream. These stories were their legacy, passed down, not in history books, but in whispers. A reminder that they'd lived, they'd mattered, and for those who'd lost children to abandonment, death, or distance, the sisterhood offered solace, a space to grieve without shame. As the governess aged, she became more than a woman. She became a myth. Victorian England loved its ghost stories, and the governess, with her liminal life, was a perfect muse. In villages and city slums, tales spread of the Grey Lady, a spectral governess who haunted old manors, her footsteps echoing in empty schoolrooms. She was said to appear where children were neglected or secrets were buried, her face pale, her eyes searching for a child she'd lost. Was she real? Perhaps not, but the stories were rooted in truth. Governesses who'd suffered, who'd vanished, whose pain lingered like a chill. These myths weren't just spooky tales. They were a way for society to grapple with the governess's existence, to acknowledge her without admitting its own cruelty. The Grey Lady wasn't just a ghost. She was a warning, a reminder that the women's society ignored could still haunt it. In some stories she was vengeful, cursing households that wronged her. In others she was tragic, weeping for a love or a child she'd never hold. Either way, she was unforgettable, her story told by servants, children, and even the families who'd once employed her. Governesses themselves contributed to these legends. Some in their later years became storytellers, weaving tales for the children of boarding houses or charity schools. They'd speak of a governess who outwitted a cruel master, or one who sailed to a new world and became a queen in disguise. These stories were half-truths, blending their own lives with fantasy, a way to reclaim their narrative. A governess who'd hidden a pregnancy might tell of a heroine who saved her child from a storm. One who'd fled scandal might spin a tale of a woman who found love beyond the sea. These stories were their rebellion, their way of saying, "We were here." The myths also served a practical purpose. They warned young governesses of the dangers ahead, men who promised love, households that demanded perfection, secrets that could destroy. A tale of a governess turned ghost was more than entertainment. It was a lesson, a survival guide whispered around a fire. And for the older governesses, these stories were a mirror, reflecting their strength, their sorrow, their refusal to be forgotten. The governess's twilight years coincided with a shift in Victorian society. The 1880s and 1890s brought the new woman, independent, educated, unafraid to challenge the old rules. The governess, though often overlooked, was her ancestor. Her struggles, poverty, exploitation, the stigma of pregnancy, laid the groundwork for the fight for women's rights. As she aged, she saw the world she'd known begin to crack, and she helped widen those cracks, even if history didn't record her name. Education was the biggest change. The governess had always been a scholar, her knowledge her only asset. Now, that knowledge was in demand. Women's colleges like Girton and Newnham at Cambridge opened in the 1870s, training teachers who were professionals, not shadows. Former governesses, some in their 50s, enrolled or taught there, their experience shaping curricula that valued women's minds. They pushed for standardized certifications, turning teaching into a career, not a stopgap for spinsters. A governess who'd once hidden her pregnancy now trained young women to demand respect, to see education as power. The suffrage movement also owed her a debt. Many suffragists were former governesses or teachers, their eloquence honed in schoolrooms, their courage forged in attics. They marched in London, Manchester and beyond, their banners demanding the vote, their speeches echoing the governess's silent defiance. A woman who'd lost a child to a foundling hospital now spoke of maternal rights. One who'd fled a scandal now demanded legal protection. Their pasts fueled their passion, their pain a rallying cry for a world where women weren't punished for being human. Economic changes helped too. Typewriters and telephones created jobs for women, roles a former governess could fill with her literacy and poise. She might work in an office, her days spent typing letters instead of correcting them, her evenings free for the first time. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a step toward independence, a chance to live without a mistress's scrutiny. And as factories and shops hired more women, the governess's skills, organization, patience, precision, made her a natural leader, a quiet force in a changing workforce. In her final days, the governess was rarely celebrated. She died in a boarding house or a charity ward, her possessions a few books, a faded shawl, a locket with a curl of hair from a child she'd lost or taught. Her funeral was small, attended by the sisterhood or a former pupil who'd never forgotten her. But her life wasn't measured in grand gestures. It was measured in moments, the lessons she taught, the stories she told, the women she inspired. She was a spark, small but stubborn, that helped light the fire of change. Some left traces. A novel, published under a pseudonym, still read in quiet libraries. A school, built with her savings, still, Ndingu, in a northern town. A letter, tucked in an archive, describing her life with unflinching honesty. These were her monuments, humble but enduring. And in the myths, the grey lady, the governess who sailed to freedom, she lived on, her story woven into the fabric of a society that had tried to erase her. The governess's legacy is ours to carry. She reminds us that strength isn't always loud, that survival is a victory, that silence can speak. She was the woman who taught when her heart was breaking, who loved when love was forbidden, who endured when endurance was all she had. Her candle burned low, but it never went out. So let's hold it high, for the governesses who lived, who fought, who shaped a world that barely saw them. Their shadows linger, not in sorrow, but in strength, a light that time can't dim.